This is Reality Dispatch, written by Jim Mins.
She felt the sand build up in her ears as she lay buried beneath the grains. The storm was fierce, and there was no shelter. She stayed under for a lengthy period. It was hard to breathe without filling her lungs with the grains. She drew air in quick breaths. At some stage, she fell asleep, for she awoke under a layer of sand. She brushed the particles off with force to draw out her legs, which were buried deep. The sand filled her jacket pockets, siphoning out of the holes in the material that lined the inside of the leather. The jacket was a good 30 years old and protected her well from the sun's rays, but the pockets were useless. She rotated 360 degrees to view the horizon and could not see her mule. It must have been swept away. Either that, or it too was buried under a mountain of sand and was unlucky enough not to have emerged as she did. She felt the bend in her mouth, the closest she could get to a frown. She would have to be on foot now in the midday sun. The star was beaming directly down on the top of her head. A streak of sweat traversed her forehead, all the way down her neck, and along the spine of her back like an old freight train on a straight track. The ones she used to watch on picnics with her dad when he'd visit. The time before the rock from the stars fell to earth and turned all into sand and dust. The walk began. No wind, no rain. The sky was blue. She removed the heavy leather jacket and placed the back over her head to protect it from the rays. This left her lower back open to burns. She felt the tightness in her skin already. These days, the sun could fry an egg and cook a steak medium well without the need for a pan. What it did to the skin of a human was torture. This was why she didn't venture out beyond the citadel, but life was unbearable inside the compound, and she dreamed of something more. The sun had moved to the left. It must have been an hour, maybe two. It was still too hot to be out, too dangerous. There were marauders. They hunted in packs. They had wheels. She was stupid for being so exposed. That's when she tripped on an iron chain that was half exposed in the sand. It sent a rush of pain from her ankle up her leg. She screeched. She sat down to look over her injury. Her ankle was intact. Her foot was able to move back and forth. There would be a bruise, but it wasn't broken. An absolute death sentence if it were. She looked over the ground where she had fallen and saw the exposed rust of the metal chains. They were large as they linked together, the size of her hand, linked over and over. She grabbed it and started to heave. It didn't move easily. She stood and bent down to grab both links with her hands. She walked backwards and pulled with all her might. The chains were attached to a large tarp that hid something under the sand. She pulled harder and harder, but was unable to move it completely. It would take 20 men. She managed to move it a fraction of the way and saw a portion of what was buried underneath. A bike, not a worthless electric one that littered the barren lands and the dried-up rivers. This was an actual bike with an actual engine, an actual motor with actual fuel inside. She looked it over and could see the liquid flowing inside the radiator. It was clean for something that was decades old. This was because it had been looked after. A mechanic's touch was evident. She glanced under the fabric that lay beside it and could make out more wheels for more machines. It was a motorcycle graveyard. Only these machines weren't dead. They were just sleeping. They belonged to the marauders. She looked at the handlebars and observed the unmistakable insignia, the skull with the blade through the eye. They had buried their inventory. This meant that they had to be nearby. She had to act fast. She lifted the bike to a standing position and mounted the seat. The key was switched on. She activated the kill switch, engaged the choke, and let the bike idle so that she could hear the engine. She revved it for nostalgia, the feel of her father as he sat behind her and allowed her to hold the handlebars. She looked down at the exhaust and made sure her legs were away. This was instinctive as she remembered burning her legs as a passenger. She revved the engine once more before a shot of fear ran from her heart into the pit of her belly. She would be drawing unwanted attention. She looked behind her, and the tarp had been fully retracted. The marauders were waking from their sand graves like the undead. Some had already emerged and began swinging bike chains around their wrists. They were treading over, ready to engage. She had awoken the mob. She removed the brake and hit the accelerator, speeding away from the threat. She traversed along the sandbanks as they progressed straight between two enormous dunes. Behind her, she could hear the ignition of 1, 2, 8, 20, 30 bikes as a cavalry began to pursue. She looked down at her handlebars and noticed, tucked under the ignition and between the blood stain on the odometer and the fuel cap, a red button, her only hope to outrun them. She pressed down with her thumb and heard the engine give off an almighty roar. The bike pressed on at speeds beyond her control. She was in the hands of the gods. The fuel was halfway when she pressed it. Now it would be lucky if there were vapors in the tank. Still, whatever was in there had sent her soaring into the abyss. The horizon presented itself as a line that emerged closer and closer. She zoomed past a blip, which turned out to be the road that linked the barrens to the citadel. She looked over her left shoulder and watched as her escape from the evil of the marauders had left her. It was too late to make a sharp turn. She looked ahead to what lay before her. She heard the ignition of the red buttons on the marauders in pursuit. Soon they would reach her, and her bike fuel would dry up. All that would be left was her wits, and how she would use them to save herself from death or enslavement. She bent her torso forward and leaned into the horizon. She embraced the speed and the uncertainty of the road ahead, the uncharted desert. The engine began to die. Soon she would be captured. She looked behind to see the marauders all slow to a halt. One by one, they killed their engines. There was a kilometer or two between them, then 3. Her bike began to spit, slow and groan. The handles became loose and swerved. She held on tight to regain control. The bike slowed further. It came to a complete stop on the edge of a cliff top that she would have sailed over if there were more fuel in the tank. The marauders knew she faced death and broke away. From the cliff top, she looked back to see the eyes of the mob watching, anticipating her disappearance. If she did not go over, they would continue their pursuit. She looked over the edge and saw a bank on the cliff top that she could stand on and kneel down, shielding herself from view. It was narrow, 1/2 meter wide, and a foot off the cliff. She prayed that it would hold her weight. She slid off the seat and sent the dead bike sailing off the cliff. She dropped to the floor and belly crawled over to the cliff bed that was below the edge. She removed her body from sight. She could hear their chains swinging, their echoes carrying from the sand dunes. She hoped she had masked herself well enough to avoid discovery. She didn't know how long she would have to wait until they were satisfied that she had sailed over the edge and passed on into Valhalla.
For more stories of fact-based fiction, head to jimmins.substack.com.